All right, folks. So now that we know how to cancel units, it's important that we have a few tools to do those conversions. So our first thing is to really knock out what are each of these equivalent to. Some of these you might know, some of them are going to be review or necessary to memorize. So the first one is that 1 mile is 5,280 feet. Hopefully you know how many inches are in a foot. There are 12 inches in a foot. Then hopefully you know how many feet there are in a yard. Those of you who like American football know yards. There are 3 feet in 1 yard. And then if you do a little bit of math to figure out the number of yards in 1 mile, essentially you would just take the 5,280 divided by 3, you're left with 1,760. So there's 1,760 yards in 1 mile. All right, so those are all distances. Let's talk about times. We should all know there are 60 minutes in an hour and then 60 seconds in 1 minute. So then thinking about that, how many seconds would there be in 1 hour? Well, hopefully you just realize you can do 60 times 60 and you're left with 3,600 seconds in an hour. So with these tools, we're going to be able to do some different practice problems. So keep those handy because you're going to use them in just a sec. So let's practice our first one here. This is pretty basic. We're going to convert 2 miles. So let's write that down, 2 miles. We'll use mi for miles into yards. So what you have to remember, just like we talked about earlier in the previous video, is that you write down a fraction and then set that equal to what you're trying to convert it into. So in this case, we're trying to convert it into yards. So thinking about that, we want to cancel out the miles. The miles is what we want to get rid of. So just like we talked about here, if we want to cancel out a unit, we have to have that same unit on the opposite side of the fraction. So since this is technically on the top, we need a miles on the bottom in order to cancel the miles on the top, okay? And then on top of that fraction, we convert the miles into what we're hoping to get it into, which would be yards. So there's one more little trick I've got for you, and that trick is to think about which of these two, the yards and the mile, which of those two units is bigger? Okay, it's really shouldn't be too hard to kind of make that determination, but once you know which one's bigger, that unit, which in this case a mile is definitely much longer than a yard, a mile is bigger. So that unit gets the number 1. That's a really good trick to remember, that the bigger unit gets the 1. So now let's remember, let's go back to our cheat sheet. 1 mile is equivalent to 1,760 yards. So now if we go ahead and that's what we write at the top right here. So 1,760, okay? So now we can actually see the cancellation happen. You can now cancel the miles with the miles. Those cancel out. And that's pretty much the only cancellation we have to do. Now we can just go ahead and multiply straight across. So we'll start in the bottom. 1 times 1 is still 1. So there's really nothing there. And then if we do 2 times 1,760, this is probably a little harder than you would need to do with a calculator, but it's possible. So, or without a calculator. So if you needed to, write this off to the side. Remember back to elementary school how to do multiplication. 2 times 0 is 0. 2 times 6 gives me 12, right? So we write the 2 down here, and then we write the 1 up here. 2 times 7 is 14 plus that 1, so that's 15. Carry the 1 again. And then 2 times 1 is 2 plus the 1 is 3. So there you are. We have 3,520 yards. That's our final answer, 3,520 yards. All right. And we've already done this earlier. We already know this answer, the 1 hour into seconds, but I wanted to show you how that would work. You would write down your 1 hour, you would multiply by the fraction, that equivalent ratio. So we're trying to cancel hours. So since we're trying to cancel the hours, hours goes on the bottom because it was on the top. It always has to be the opposite side that it was on. And we're trying to convert it into seconds. So that's what goes on top. We ask ourselves that little trick question, which one is bigger? Obviously, an hour is bigger than a second. So the hour gets the 1, and then there were 3,600 seconds in an hour. So there's our ratio to convert. Hours cancel out. We're left with 3,600 seconds. So just trying to get that practice there. This is really the extent of what we want to accomplish today is this last problem right here about Mary Grace. So let's jump into that one and see kind of how it works, okay? So the first thing we're told is that Mary Grace runs 3,520 yards in 20 minutes. That's our starting fraction, 3,520 yards in 20 minutes, okay? So notice, just like we talked about in our previous example, we have a distance, the yards, and we have a time, the minute. And we're actually going to be canceling both of those. We're actually going to get rid of both the distance and the time. We want to convert the distance into miles and the time into hours. All right? So let's let our first fraction be our distance fraction, and our second fraction be our time fraction. And now let's set up our units. We're trying to cancel yards. So that means that if yards is on the top here in the distance fraction, it needs to go on the bottom. And then we're trying to cancel minutes in the bottom. So in our time fraction, minutes has to go on the top. So really important that we get those in first. Then we replace it with what we're trying to convert into. In this case, we're trying to convert into miles, and we're trying to convert into hours. All right. So now we can actually start our cancellation by asking the question, which one's bigger? So who's bigger, a mile or a yard? Hopefully you don't mess that one up. That's definitely a mile. And it's equivalent to, use your cheat sheet, 1,760 yards. And what's bigger, a mile, or excuse me, a minute or an hour? Definitely an hour. That's equivalent to 60 minutes. So now we're going to do our simplification. First things first, units. Yards cancels with yards. Gone. Minutes on top cancels with minutes on the bottom. Gone. So now that we've canceled our units, now we need to start canceling numbers. And here's where it looks challenging because we don't have a calculator, but it's not as bad as you think. We're going to be kind to you. How many times, we actually just practiced this, how many times does 1,760 go in to 3,520? That's why we did this practice problem right up here. That was 2 times. You can see that it went in 2 different times when we multiplied. So this cancels out, it goes to a 1. This cancels out and turns into a 2 because 1,760 goes into 3,520 2 times. Last but not least, 20 also goes into 60. So the 20 goes into 60 how many times? Hopefully you said 3 times. Okay? So last but not least, we can actually do our multiplication. Don't get lost in all the different work here. We have 2 times 1 mile, so that's 2 miles. 2 miles times 3, so that leaves us with 6 miles right here on top. 2 times 1 times 3, 6 miles. On the bottom, once again, don't get lost in all of it. We have 1 times 1 times 1 hour. Not very difficult. 1 times 1 times 1 gives me 1 hour. So our speed here is 6 miles per hour. That's how fast Mary Grace is running / walking, whatever that might be. That's our goal for today, to really practice those items and make those conversions happen. So you have a couple more practice problems. Work those with your neighbors and check with Mr. Montag for the key. Best of luck, guys. We'll talk to you soon.